Hi, my name is Tara Wise. Welcome to sewing class. Today we're going to learn how to sew one of 3 different projects. You will have signed up for one of them. If you enjoy doing that, you can do all 3. Our choices today include a backpack pin. We have this pattern and some others in the handouts, or you can choose to create your own. Or a superhero cuff. The other project is a stuffed animal. We have patterns for a bear, a dolphin, or a snake. You can choose to use one of these or make your own. Now, I got all of these projects, and there are many others in this book called Sewing School by Amy Petronas Plumley and Andrea Lisley. This book is full of great ideas just for kids for learning how to sew. I hope you enjoy this class. We're going to start with a few different basic techniques that you need to learn in order to do any of these projects and any other kinds of sewing projects you might want to do. We're going to start with how to choose fabric, learning how to thread a needle, how to sew on a button, and how to do a few basic stitches. Thanks for joining me. Our first mini lesson is going to be how to choose fabric for your project. There's a lot of fabric choices out there. There's fun things like fleece, like your pajamas might be made of, or you might have a fleece blanket. This used to be pajamas. This is an old t-shirt. It's kind of worn out. This one will be good for a lot of the projects. This particular t-shirt is not very stretchy. And the great thing about t-shirt material is that it doesn't fray on the edges. So these two are great choices because they don't fray on the edges for your projects. Another great choice is craft felt. You can buy this in the fabric store or a craft store, and you probably have made things with this. This also does not pull on the edges. So when I talk about a fabric that frays on the edge, I mean something like this. This is a nice flannel fabric, but if you look at the edges, you can see that they're kind of pulling apart. And if I try to sew this near the edge, what's going to happen is it'll pull out and my project will fall apart. And so we don't want to use a fabric that can pull out on the edges and ruin our project. So this one is not a good choice for these kinds of projects, although it's great for something else. And this one too is a quilting cotton that also, for these kinds of projects, if you stitch too near the edge, it can pull out and your project just won't be as nice. A couple sources for projects then, or for fabrics. If you don't have a fabric stash, you can look at old clothes with an adult's permission, something maybe that doesn't fit you or has been ruined with holes. This one used to be pajamas, but now we've outgrown it and they had holes in the feet. This too used to be a really nice t-shirt, but again, it's past its prime. But it's perfect for a project like this. Now again, there's some fabrics that fray on the edges. Button-down shirts, for example, probably won't be a great choice. Another kind of fabric that won't be a great choice is a t-shirt that is very stretchy. This shirt stretches a lot. So it's not going to be as great for these projects because when you stuff things into them or try and do stuff with them, it'll stretch out of shape and your project won't look as nice. This t-shirt is not stretchy. So you kind of want to look for that if you're looking for fabrics, something that's not as stretchy like this one and doesn't fray like this one. And here's another old fabric choice. This is a pair of jeans that has holes in them. So this one would be not too bad, but jeans do kind of fray on the edge, so I would recommend not using jeans for these projects either. In this little mini lesson, we're going to learn how to thread a needle. So, the very most important thing you need to know about a needle is that because they are sharp, you need to always know where your needle is. If you're not using it, you need to have it pushed into a fabric or somewhere safe. Because if you drop this, you do not want to find it 2 days later with your feet. That will hurt. So, when you thread a needle, you take it out of your safe place and you start with getting a good amount of thread. Now, a pretty good amount is usually about as long as your arm. You do not want to go longer than that. It gets to be too hard to work with. If you run out while you're sewing, you can always tie a knot and start it again. So, I have a piece here that's a pretty good length, and I'm going to cut the end. This particular kind of thread is called a craft thread. It's pretty thick and it kind of looks similar to embroidery thread, but it's easy to sew with, easy to see, and it's nice and strong, and it comes in lots of fun colors. This needle is called a chenille needle. It has a nice big head that is pretty easy to get your thread into, and because we're sewing with fabric, it has a sharp-ish point to get through the fabric. Other kinds of needles that are similar to this, like an embroidery needle, also have a big head, but their end might be dull so that it can fit through the holes in embroidery. That'd be a really frustrating kind of needle to use for sewing. So you want a needle with a point if you're sewing through fabric, and you want to make sure that the eye of the needle is bigger than the thread that you're trying to use. So again, this is craft thread, but you can use regular thread. You could even use a skinny string if you have a needle that's big enough. Kind of all depends on what's available to you. Now, so I'm going to show 2 different ways to thread this needle. So this little needle threader is called a low ran. And if you have one of these, here's how this works. You put your needle over it like this and kind of hang it on this little hooky space. Then you take your thread and you loop your thread into the hook. So you have kind of an arrangement that looks like this. And then you pull your needle over the end and you have your thread on and you're ready to go. So that's very convenient, but if you don't have that, then you can take this end here, and this end is the end I just cut. It's usually an easier end to work with. And I usually kind of lick it to make it damp and flat. It just helps an awful lot with getting it into the needle. And then you poke it into the needle end. And there you go, like that. So we have our needle threaded, and now we're going to want to tie a knot at the other end. And this is kind of like what you do to tie your shoes. You just put one side over and poke it through and pull it tight, just like that. And now you are ready to start sewing. And we'll talk about why we need this knot in the next video. In this lesson, we're going to go over a couple basic stitches. You will have your thread that you learned how to thread onto your needle in the last lesson, and you tied a knot on the end so that when you start stitching, the thread doesn't just pull right on through your fabric. So we're going to do the whip stitch and the running stitch. This first one is the whip stitch. You take your 2 pieces of fabric and you put them next to each other where you want them to be. So when you're sewing 2 pieces of fabric together, it's nice to have some pins or clips to hold them together so that they don't move away from each other and then you start sewing wrong. For this, I'd like to use safety pins. You can stick them in and shut them so that you don't accidentally poke yourself. Or if you prefer, it's a little bit easier, but also a little bit riskier, you can use straight pins. You just want to be careful to try to not poke yourself because they're sharp and you might bleed. So we have our thread, we have our fabric pieces that are stuck together so they don't come apart. And with the whip stitch, you just go in near the edge, you poke your needle through, and here on the back side you see we've got our knot that doesn't poke through. And then we run the needle around, the thread and the needle around the outside. So you keep coming up from the bottom, like this. So here I pulled it up, I'm going to come back around and poke it in through the bottom again. And we're going to just keep doing this all along this edge. And now this edge of these two pieces of fabric is stuck together. They're not going to be able to come apart. Now something else you'll notice is that my stitches are fairly close together. That way, when you try and say stuff your project, if you're going to do the stuffies, your insides don't come apart or your fabric doesn't pull apart. So here I'll show you what a longer stitch can do. Right here I'm going to make a very long stitch, and here I can stick my finger right through there, and stuffing can stick out through there too. So we want to try and keep them close together. So the whip stitch goes around the outside just from the bottom up every time. The running stitch, see now that my fabric's stuck together I can take out the needle. It's not going to go anywhere. The running stitch, it alternates. You go down and then you go up. And this one you maybe have done before in classes or with threading boards or that sort of thing. But this one goes back and forth, and instead of the thread going around the outside, it just goes along next to the outside. But either way, you're going to end up with two pieces of fabric that are stuck together. Just like this. Now, when you get to the end, you're going to tie another knot. Or if your thread gets short and you're still working on it, you're still going to do the same thing. You're going to tie a knot, and it'll be just like the first one. But with this one, what you can do is stick your needle near there and tie your knot around the needle. Just loop it around the needle a couple times and then pull it out like this. And then if you stick your needle back in this loop like that while you pull it down, your knot will stay right next to the fabric. Or you can kind of just do it the other way. But here you see I've got a nice new knot right next to the fabric, and I cut it off and I'm done. So in this lesson we're going to learn how to sew on a button. Like in the last lesson where we were sewing a line, we need to start by tying a knot at the end of our string. Now I have a variety of buttons here, and just about any of them will work. This one has 4 holes, this one here has just 2 holes, but that's fine, either one will do. Now I have one button here that's not a great choice for this particular project. This button here has a thing in the back called a shank, which helps it stick out from the fabric. For this particular project, that's not a great button, but any of the rest of these will be fine. You can get buttons at craft stores and fabric stores, or if, with an adult's permission, you've got some old clothes with buttons that are worn out or otherwise not needed anymore, you can scavenge buttons off of old clothes. So, to sew on a button, you start by picking your button, and it's handy to mark the spot where you want to put it so that it's easy to remember, especially if you're choosing where to put your button earlier in your project. So then I will hold the button over top of the spot I want to put it on, and I'll like pinch it between my fingers on the fabric. Now this part's a little bit trickier just because you have to stick the needle in from the back side and you can't see what you're doing. So it usually takes me a couple tries to figure out where the buttonhole is. It's in there somewhere. Maybe right here. Nope. We'll try this other one. Oop, shoot. There we go. So now I have the first one, and it's going to be a lot easier after the first one. But that first one takes a little trying. So then you come up from the back side through the first hole, then you go back down through the next hole and the fabric. So now my button is attached to the fabric and I don't have to pinch it quite so carefully. But you want to go back, since this one has 4 holes, I'm going to come back and I'm going to go through the other pair of holes. And it's a lot easier to find those holes once you've got the first couple in. Like that. And I like to do this a couple of times because I want my buttons to stay put once they're there and never ever come off again. There we go. Now there are some other tricks for when you're sewing buttons on clothes and things, but I'm not going to show you those today. If you want to learn that kind of thing, you can ask an adult or find one of lots of different tutorials on the internet. So I've done all of my stitches, and then I'm going to tie a knot, and again this is the end knot, just like when you're sewing a line of a stitch. So I have it knotted on there. This button is not going to fall off. And I snip my thread and I am all set. I have a button stuck on that will never come off. Thank you for joining me for the Little Friend Sewing Project. This is a stuffed animal that you can make yourself. Now, in this particular project, I have 3 example patterns. You can choose those or you can make your own. Here's what we've got included in the handout. We have a stuffed bear. We have a stuffed dolphin and a snake. Now, these were made by my kids. They enjoyed them very much, and they made the style that suited what they wanted to make. In order to make this, you're going to need a list of materials, and you'll have a handout here that has the material list and some basic instructions. So you can follow along with what I'm doing, or you can look at the instruction list, or do kind of both. I'm not going to repeat the things that we've done earlier. So I've already shown you how to sew on the buttons, how to thread a needle, how to choose fabric. I'm not really going to discuss that again now. If you need to look into that, you can go back in the video and look at those parts of the videos again in order to learn more about how to sew on a button or do any of those other things that are part of this project. So, in your material list, you'll have patterns, and there are 3 patterns included in this particular handout. We have the bear, the dolphin, and the snake. Now, if you want to make your own, you want to make sure that it is fatter than you think it should be. This is the snake pattern that this little guy was made from. It looks like a really fat snake, but once you stuff it full and round, it's going to get skinnier looking. So you want to make sure that your pieces are fat enough so that when you stuff them, they're not too small and they're easy to work with, and they look right after they've gotten rounder. You will also need 2 pieces of fabric, one for the front and one for the back. They can be the same like they are on the stuffed animal, the bear and the dolphin, or you could choose to do 2 different fabrics like the snake has. It's got an orange tummy and the stripy backside, and really creatively, this particular snake has a tongue which got sewed onto its front. You could do that, or you could choose to not do that. I'm going to use this piece of fire engine fabric that I have. You will also need a needle and some thread. You will need buttons for the eyes on your animal. You're going to need some safety pins to hold your pieces together while you're sewing them. You'll need a pair of scissors. And for the stuffed animal project, you will also need stuffing and something to help push it in with. And chopsticks work really well for that. I think this table knife will also work really well if you don't have a chopstick available to you. So to start with a project, you want to have your pattern in front of you. And what you're going to do is you're going to pin it to your fabric. We're going to do this 2 times, one for the front and one for the back. If you have a thinner fabric, you can do them both at the same time, but it's hard to cut when you're using something thick like this particular piece of fleece. So I have my pattern and I am going to attach it right on. If you like, you can cut the pattern out and the fabric at the same time for the first side. By pinning it on, I make sure it doesn't slide around and do weird things with my project. I want it to end up being shaped the same. All right. And I'm going to cut this away because that'll make it much easier for me to work with a smaller piece of fabric. Now I'm going to cut out the paper and the fabric together. Or if you like, you can cut the paper out first and then attach it to the fabric. That can be easier sometimes. So it's kind of up to whatever you prefer to do. Take your time. You don't need to do this fast. It's better to do it a little bit slower and kind of get it right, and maybe I should have used more safety pins. So when you're doing this, use lots of safety pins. It makes it much easier. Now it can be hard to cut with this kind of scissors. If you want, if you have permission from adult to borrow a bigger, sharper scissors, that can be very helpful. This one's not too bad, but it's definitely easier with a sharper scissors. All right, so you can see that my fabric and my paper don't really match all that well in a couple places. It would have been better for me to use a couple more pins there so that they stayed closer together. So now I can cut it out a little bit more, but you know, next time I'll use more safety pins. All right, so there's the front of my bear. Now, because I chose a fabric that has a front and a back side, right? This is the front of the fabric. It's fuzzy and it's really easy to see the engines. On this back side, it's not the same. So when you have your stuffed animal, you want to make sure that it has a front and a back side. So when I put this down on the pattern, I put it on the front side. So then the next time when I cut out the back, which is going to be exactly the same steps as cutting out the front, I'm going to turn my pattern, I'm going to put my fabric right side up like this, and I'm going to turn my pattern upside down. That way when I'm all done, I will have a front of my creature and a back of my animal or creature, and they will fit together properly. And this time I'm going to learn from my mistake last time and use more sewing, more safety pins. It takes a little while to get them in there, but it's worth it once you've got them in, because you'll have a nicer project and it will be much easier to cut out. So even though it takes more time right at the beginning, you'll save some time while you're cutting it out and not make mistakes. So this time I'm cutting only the fabric. The paper's already been cut out. Now that I've got my back all cut out, I'm going to take out the safety pins, and I'm going to use them again in just a couple minutes, so I'm not going to bother sticking them back together. But I am going to set them aside in a safe place. All right, so my bear has a front and a back now. And the next step is not to sew them together. The thing we're going to do next is put the eyes on the bear, the button eyes. So here I have a pair of buttons, and I have a pen to mark where I want the eyes to be. It's a lot better to mark them first. So I'm going to put my eyes right here. So use a marker or a pen or some other drawing thing to decide exactly where you want your eyes to be. All right, good. Now I'm going to get out my thread. And as we covered earlier, if you need a refresher, go back to that part. I'm going to cut a piece of thread about this long. I'm going to thread it into my needle. All right. I'm going to tie a knot on the end. All right, and I'm going to put one of my eyes on top of one of the dots that I just made so that I know it's in the right spot. And I am going to sew on this button eye, just like we covered in the button sewing class earlier. So you can go back to that if you need to right now. And I'm going to sew on both eyes the same way right now. Tie a knot in the back. And move on to the next eye. I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to put it on top of the dot that I made and sew on this little button. Now if you want, you could add extra decorations with markers or other drawing or coloring tools. You could add a mouth if you liked. You could sew on a mouth with a little running stitch. Or a nose. If you really want to get creative, you could add paws or a belt or anything else that you think your particular stuffed creation ought to have. The fun thing about this is that each one is different. They are all unique and none of them are the same. All right, so my bear has eyes now. Now that he's got eyes, I can attach the front and back together. So I'm going to turn the front side upside down, nice and flat, and I'm going to put the back side on top of it, and I'm going to make sure that the backs of the fabric are facing each other. This is how it should look when it's done, with the nice side out, front and back. All right. And then we're going to pin these two pieces together a lot like we did with the pattern so that they stay together while we sew it. And you really can't have too many pins. Now some fabrics don't really have a right side and a wrong side. I think this bear right here, both sides of this fleece are pretty much exactly the same. So then you don't have to worry about a front and a back. You can just go ahead and sew it either way. But if you do have a fabric that has a right and a wrong side, you want to be super careful to make sure that you've got it attached the right way before you start sewing. And you want to try and make sure the edges are on top of each other. So flatten them down nice so that the edges are just right lined up. Because once you've got this attached like this, this is how it's going to be. It's not going to change from this much while you're sewing. All right. So we have our thread from earlier when we put on the buttons, and we're gonna start as before with putting a little knot at the end, and then you're gonna choose what kind of stitch you want to do around your animal. I kind of like the whip stitch. That's what was used on I think all three of these projects for this one, You can do the running stitch or you can do something different. Now, because you're making a stuffed animal with stuffing inside that will stick out if you're not careful, you want to try and make your stitches fairly close together. So this snake has a few areas where the stitches are farther apart, and if you look close you can kind of see the stuffing through them. If your stitches are really big, the stuffing might actually start coming out. So try and keep your stitches pretty close together. And just pick a spot on your stuffed animal and start stitching. This is going to take a few minutes, and I'm going to be speeding up my videos so that you don't have to watch me stitch around the whole thing. But just, go at it slowly and carefully, having stitches just all the way around. There's no big rush here. Now you want your stitches to be kind of close to the edge, but not right at the edge. So you can see mine here. They're a little ways away from the edge. So you'll still be able to see them when we're done. So you want to choose a thread that you like. So you're going to need more than one piece of thread to get through this whole project. And this is a pretty long project actually, so you're probably going to want to take some breaks too. Feel free to wander off and come back to this whenever you're ready to start over and keep working on it again. Now, I've gotten pretty close to the end of a thread. I have just a few inches left. So I'm going to just tie a knot and start a new thread. No problem. So this one was kind of short. It's not going to last long, but I'll just use it anyway. And I like to take the safety pins out as I go once I'm done with them, because they kind of get in the way when you're not needing them anymore. So this particular leg is all stitched around, so I don't need the safety pin there anymore. Oops, see here, I did let my short string get too short, or didn't get it too short, and it got caught in my thing. So I pulled it out and just pulled that end a little shorter so that it's a lot shorter than the other part, and I'm good to go for a few more stitches now. All right. So when you get to the spot where you have maybe 3 inches or so left, you want to stop sewing for a little bit. Just take your needle off your thread, put it back in your little thing, your safety piece. And now we're going to stuff the animal. So for that you're going to need your stuffing, and you're going to want to make sure all of your safety pins are out. Alright, so you need your stuffing and your stuffing pusher inner tool. So what you're going to do is grab your big chunks of stuffing and shove them in through that hole. You don't want super big chunks if you've got smaller bits. Like that chunk was really too big for my bear's ears. So you're going to start filling it from the other end. So I'm going to push that piece of stuffing all the way in, mostly with my hands, to the back, to the other end of my bear, and I'm going to stuff it into his ears. There we go. And you can really put in a lot of stuffing. It should be pretty stuffed. If you don't put in quite enough, see how fat that is. If you don't put in quite enough, he's going to get kind of flat over time. So this looks like a lot, but it's probably only a little bit too much for this guy. So mostly you'll use your hands. The stuffing pusher tool is helpful though for some of those far away skinny bits. There we go. Now his ears are stuffed full. And we just keep working our way back, stuffing them nice and full, back toward the hole that we've left open in order to stuff in the stuffing. All right, I'm gonna stuff his arms next. You want to just use like hand-sized chunks. And really fill those ends, the arms and ears and legs up. Really stuff them full. And you really can't put in too much stuffing. All right, I'm gonna put a little bit more in, and then I'm gonna sew my hole up a little smaller. I think I might have made it a little bigger than I should have. There we go. Okay. And you just keep stitching and make sure it's a little trickier now because the stuffing wants to pull your fabric apart. So make sure you keep your stitches nice and tight. I'm going to put in a few more stitches and then add the rest of the stuffing. Which will be trickier because the hole is smaller. And just keep stuffing it into those little spaces and make sure they're all very full. All right, I think this guy's got just about the right amount. See, I used up almost all of what was in that bag. Okay. I'm going to finish sewing up that hole and tie a knot, and then we'll be all set. All right, so now I've done my last little knot and I cut my thread, and you might squish them up a little bit, and there we go. There we go. Little stuffed animal made by hand and out of materials you can get almost anywhere. I hope you really enjoyed this class and made something that is unique and special just for you. Thanks for joining me.